This course is Nurse Leadership Resiliency. My name is Leslie Kelly. I am a nurse scientist at Common Spirit Health. I have a background in studying clinician burnout and well-being in the nursing workforce and healthcare workers. I'll be talking to you today about how nurse leaders look at clinician burnout and strategies for building well-being. Our objectives for today are to identify manifestations of burnout in our nursing workforce, but we're going to specifically look at sources of stress for nurse leaders and how that's different. We'll be talking about strategies for improving personal resilience well-being and strategies for the unit's culture of well-being, and then we'll talk about how to sustain that culture of well-being. So just a little background. We have such a great profession. We love being nurses. We often feel like we're called to this profession. We work in this profession because we enjoy being here. We enjoy it for different reasons, patient care, working with our staff. But we also know we have some really big problems in the nursing profession. We know we have issues around turnover, intent to leave. We know we have communication issues. We know we even have issues around incivility and bullying. So why in this profession that we love so much is burnout such a big issue? So researchers like myself have been studying burnout for a really long time. And we don't study it for the sake of giving self-care tips or trying to make people feel better at the end of the day. We study it because it's a really important issue when it comes to patient care. We know from decades of research that when we have clinician burnout and when our healthcare workers aren't well, there's an impact on patient care. We know that we need to improve our clinician burnout because when our clinicians do well, our patient care improves. So we're going to start by talking about understanding burnout, stress, and resilience, and really dig into these concepts for what they mean and how they impact the workforce. And then we'll get into the strategies because we've already got the science behind what each of these concepts mean. So let's start with a really simple model. So this is the professional quality of life model. It's very simple because it basically looks like two sides. But what I want to emphasize here is this is not a balance. You do see on one side that we have compassion fatigue that is made up of burnout and secondary trauma. But then on the other side is our compassion satisfaction. What's important here is to note that we all want professional quality of life. We get our quality of life in different types of ways. But when it comes to our work and our professional quality of life, this is not a daily balance, right? You can think about times in your career where maybe things were going really well, you were really enjoying your profession and parts or aspects of it. But then I'm sure you can think of other parts of your career or times in your career where maybe you were feeling the other side of this, where you were feeling a little burned out or you were having some experiences that were bringing on stress. So we'll talk about each of these aspects more in depth, but the point is that our goal here is for a professional quality of life, and then it's not about a daily balance. So let's start with the first concept, and that's burnout. When we think about burnout, a famous researcher comes to mind, Christina Maslach. She's the one that really identified burnout for clinicians and how we think about it in the clinician well-being realm. Burnout's a pretty universal concept. We've all had burnout at some point in our life. You can think about burnout with lots of things that you do, right? Burnout with your hobbies, or burnout with your children, or burnout if you're in school and feeling some burnout with your homework. But when we think about clinician burnout, there's definitely aspects of it that are unique to our healthcare work. And these are the three manifestations of how we think about burnout, and manifestations being those symptoms or experiences that you're having. The first one is emotional and physical exhaustion. So this is so much more than I'm tired. This is I'm drained. I can no longer do this. I don't feel like I can come back and give any more into the work that I'm doing. And when you think about this being a profession that we love and we need to give empathy and caring for our patients, emotional and physical exhaustion is one of the biggest problems that we have. We need to bring our whole selves to our work. And so when we're emotionally and physically exhausted, burnout becomes a big issue. The second one is depersonalization, also very significant because this means we disconnect. We really have lost that empathy or that ability to connect with our patients, with our staff, with others. And this is a problem because maybe we start thinking about them as that diagnosis in that room, or we're not able to give the empathy for the experience that they're going through. And in healthcare, when they're very vulnerable, when patients are, at a point where they're breaking their health, they're at a point where their continuum of health is not optimal, this is a quality that is needed from their healthcare worker. So when we are not able to connect, or when we depersonalize that patient and we're experiencing burnout, it absolutely impacts patient care. And then the last one is personal accomplishment, or in the case of burnout, a lack of personal accomplishment. Absolutely significant for any type of employee in any field. As employees, we want to grow, we want to climb the ladder, we want to improve ourselves, we want to do well for our company. And so when we have a lack of personal accomplishment, that desire is not there. We don't want to join committees, we don't want to improve shared governance, we don't want to make the processes better in our organization. Remember, an organization is made up of the people that are in it. So when we don't want to make our culture better, we don't want to improve anything within it, it impacts the entire organization. So when you think about these aspects of burnout, it's so much more than just the individual. It has impact on everything around it. The other aspect of burnout that doesn't always get discussed as much, but certainly with the impact of COVID-19 is coming into light more, is secondary traumatic stress. This has a huge influence on burnout, and especially as healthcare workers, we are exposed to this type of stress, and the risk for this type of stress is there. So as I mentioned, when we care for patients, when we care for people in healthcare, they are there because of likely a break in their health. They are experiencing something that is not ideal for them, right? And so at this risk period in their time, at this time when they're experiencing a low, we are there with them, and over and over and over again. And so, yes, it may be a trauma, but it might also be a terrible diagnosis, a death, an injury, something that is disrupting to them, mentally distressing to them. And then we are there potentially picking up that stress, that trauma as well. So when we experience that trauma, that mental distress, that risk of another, we are a secondary traumatic victim of that stress. And so what happens is we can have those symptoms related to that secondary traumatic stress. So symptoms or thoughts, emotions, or behaviors related to that event. And then the healthcare worker, the nurse, can then have symptoms related, such as lack of sleep, poor appetite, more dissatisfaction with your job. And remember, this is a contributor to burnout. So you're already feeling those feelings, and now you're having these secondary traumatic stress event feelings, mood changes. And this may sound very similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, which is actually a diagnosis related to an event and has defined criteria related to it. And so those are separate things, but the relationship here is that secondary traumatic stress is a very large category and puts you at high risk for PTSD. Much of our workforce can experience secondary traumatic stress, while few may go into the category of post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. What I want to talk about is the specific stressors for nurse leaders. So remember, first and foremost, our nurse leaders are nurses. They are clinicians. And so they have experienced the burnout and the secondary traumatic stress of being a clinician, being with clinicians, being part of that clinical care environment. And a lot of times they burn out and then go into a nurse leader position and now are experiencing these additional nurse leader stressors, these job demands and organizational constraints. And so when we think about the job demands related to a nurse leader, they are certainly significant above and beyond other types of professions. So a nurse leader has multiple roles, right? They are part of a clinical care environment, but also an organizational leader, in addition to many other tasks they may have. They have competing priorities. They may be dealing with families, with staff, with organizational leaders, with financial leaders, and each has their own priority put on the nurse leader. Often their roles are not defined and they have ambiguity. I can think of within my own organization at least 30 different titles that we have for nurse leaders. And so we give them different duties as assigned related to how we create those roles. And then nurse leaders have very large spans of control. It's documented that in other organizations, you might have 20 or 30 employees as a nurse leader, but it's very common in the nursing profession to have 70, 80, 100 employees within your scope as a nurse leader. So here's a lot of job demands being a nurse leader. The other thing you may see is that there are many organizational constraints for nurse leaders and healthcare leaders in general. Situational barriers, when you think about healthcare in the United States and across the world, there are situational barriers related to how we provide care, the insurance related to care, the moral distress around care. So situations, even regional within the United States, we have lots of situational barriers. Interpersonal conflict between professions, and then think about between families, between staff. So nurse leaders are often the ones who are involved in resolving that interpersonal conflict. Human and financial resources are constantly a stressor or an organizational constraint for nurse leaders when we think about our staffing needs, our financial needs, resources that are needed, product needs. A nurse leader cares for the entire unit and the supplies and the staffing and the human resources related to that unit. And then, as I mentioned in the very beginning, quite frankly, there are hostilities within our healthcare environment. And so incivility, bullying, and human resource issues related to our healthcare and how our organization allows nurse leaders to handle that. So as a nurse leader, in addition to that clinical care environment, there are certainly additional stressors that they take that can contribute to a nurse leader's burnout. All right, so that was a lot. We got burnout and secondary traumatic stress and nurse leaders who have additional stressors. So why? We go back to that professional quality of life. Why be in this profession? Why do this role? Why be in nursing? We know that we love this profession, right? That was the very first slide in all of this. We have this other bucket and we call that compassion satisfaction. And this is why we love nursing. This is why we love healthcare. Many of us say we're called to the field. We use words like, I wouldn't do anything else. This is my purpose in life. I couldn't imagine any other job, because we find so much compassion satisfaction in this field. And that is defined as finding joy in our work. And we do find joy in our work. We are defined by being nurses, defined by being leaders, defined by working in healthcare. What may have changed is that now we talk about finding joy in our work as something we have to do. So there is some healthy amount of skepticism to this idea that we have to go find the joy in our work. It used to be that I go to work, I enjoy it, I enjoy interacting with the patients, and it's this there and I love it. But now we say things like, but there's too many organizational constraints, but the staffing is too bad, but. So now we have to work at finding joy in work. And the skepticism around that is, but why should I have to? And I think this is our healthcare environment. This is the situation that we're in. And maybe that's different now. Maybe that's different from other concepts that we've talked about, like satisfaction. We need to raise satisfaction in nurses, or engagement. We need to engage our nurses. And then certainly these conversations have been, we need wellness, we need well-being, we need to make sure we ourselves are well. So when we talk about compassion satisfaction, there is ownership to it, that we need to find joy in work, but we couple that with the idea of making sure that we are resilient and we are strong. And so that's the next conversation that we want to have. What is resilience, right? We know we've talked about these adversities in our work environment. We know that there are barriers. We know that there is burnout. We know that our healthcare environment has changed. Resilience is the ability to bounce back, cope, or face that adversity and adapt. Not everyone likes the word bounce, right? We don't want to be bouncing. So it's really that ability to take on that adversity and adapt from it and change. You take a look at this picture here, right? It's when the landscape is dry, when there's no chance that a flower should be growing out of this, here comes a flower. Now, what's interesting about resilience is it's part of our psychological capital, right? So we all have some of it. It's all in us. We all have some resilience. I have some resilience. Person next to me has some resilience. It might be different levels of resilience. But one of the things we've learned is that we can get more of it. We can build it up, and it can be learned. So that's why we go out and we try to get more. We practice resilience building strategies. We go and we learn more resilience. We work at it. And so resilience is our way to help build that compassion satisfaction, decrease our burnout, and mitigate our secondary traumatic stress. Now, what I want to be really cautious is what resilience is not. Again, we look at this flower. We say, yes, it came out of here, but if it never rains again and the soil is not fertile, we don't expect that flower to live. We don't expect that flower to just stay alive amidst adverse conditions, right? So resilience is not your personal shield. You don't expect you to be this healthy individual who works really hard and has great resilience, but then keeps going back into an adverse situation. Don't keep going back into an unhealthy work environment. Don't keep going back into a poor communication situation or poor leadership or somewhere where the resources are terrible and expect yourself to have that compassion satisfaction, because it's not a personal shield. So a strong caution, because resilience has become quite a buzzword, that it's not your shield, it is your strategy coupled with a healthy work environment. So as we move into the next section, we want to be very clear that there are two parts of this equation, that we want to be strong, we want to have personal resilience building, but we also want to create a healthy work environment.